Pop quiz. What's Southeast Asia's biggest capital, is nicknamed the Big Durian, and is the world's fastest sinking city? Jakarta. It's Indonesia's capital, but it won't be for much longer. It suffered from endemic pollution, flooding, and overcrowding. Traffic alone cost the country up to $5 billion a year in economic losses. The government solution? Build a new capital from scratch on the island of Borneo. It's called Nusantara and is touted as an efficient, utopian capital run on green energy.
If the implementation is so poor, rather than being a model city for Southeast Asia, it's going to be a disaster.
But what are the consequences of building a city from ground zero? And will this really solve Jakarta's problems? Before we drone dive into Nusantara, we've got to understand what's going on with Jakarta. The city is literally sinking at a rate of up to 25 centimeters a year in some areas. Some researchers say that a quarter of the city will be underwater by 2050. The biggest problem is that Jakarta is pumping way too much groundwater. More than 60% of the population relies on groundwater wells. This is actually a legacy of colonialism. When the Dutch colonized the city in the 1600s, they named it Batavia and built it with a system of canals that aimed to reduce flooding, but also to segregate the population. They used unbridged canals to separate ethnic groups and create a colonial system of social stratification. This was typical of colonial urban design, and you can find it in many cities in India as well, like Calcutta, Kochi, and Chennai.
Jakarta was a little Amsterdam in the colony at that time.
This is Eka Parmanasari, a professor of urban design at Monash University in southwest Jakarta.
They create the wall, they create all these canals, but they forgot that Indonesia is a tropical country.
In short, Southeast Asia is not Northern Europe, and the canals didn't work. They got clogged by sedimentation from irregular water flow, and the stagnant water spread disease. The Europeans moved their settlements further south, and eventually developed piped water for themselves, leaving the majority of Batavia with groundwater wells. This colonial infrastructure remained even after Indonesia's independence in 1945. As Jakarta grew, the canals were paved over by streets, skyscrapers went up, and soon the city was polluted, overpopulated, and flooding regularly. The idea of moving the capital has actually been around for a few decades. It was floated during Suharto's dictatorship in the 1980s and re-emerged in 2010. But in 2019, President Joko Widodo finally approved a roughly $33 billion plan to build a new capital from scratch on the east coast of Borneo. Its new name? Nusantara, an old Javanese term for archipelago.
Ibu kota yang bukan hanya simbol identitas bangsa, tetapi juga representasi kemajuan bangsa. Ini demi terwujudnya pemerataan dan keadilan ekonomi. Ini demi visi Indonesia maju.
Jokowi has said publicly that the move is meant to shift the economic weight off of Jakarta and that it would develop Indonesia's economy in historically neglected regions.
This entire high-value industrial sector, based on Indonesia's comparative advantages like land, water for hydropower, and also feedstock and labor force.
This is Chun Go. He's an expert in sustainable development in Southeast Asia. With this move, Indonesia will join a roster of other built-from-scratch capitals like Brasilia, Canberra, and Islamabad. With many Indian cities like Delhi also facing similar issues, Nusantara could be the newest case study for potential solutions, or hard lessons learned. So, the big question is, what's Nusantara supposed to look like? Like this. Or what it's supposed to be anyway. Nusantara, which will be roughly twice the size of New York City, will cover over 2,500 square kilometers in the province of East Kalimantan. The area is currently covered in eucalyptus plantations, so the new capital wouldn't be tearing into protected forest. In the government's plan, Nusantara will be a green, hyper-connected digital utopia in the middle of a lush landscape. It'll be entirely fueled by renewable sources, have highly accessible public transportation, and 75% of it will be covered in green spaces. But why is the government launching such a massive undertaking?
Indonesia has never shied away from expressing its hunger for modernization and industrialization. It has been taking a very pragmatic approach to achieving its dream of leapfrogging toward a high-income country.
Currently, more than half the country's GDP comes from Java Island, where Jakarta is located. Go says that moving the capital is just part of the country's bigger development strategy, which is to jumpstart a green industrial economy in the Kalimantan part of Indonesia. Want proof? Just look at where the dams are getting built. The government is constructing 5 hydropower stations on the Kayan River to speed up industrialization. President Widodo is planning the world's biggest green industrial park north of Nusantara. Why? Well, Indonesia has the world's largest nickel reserves, and, as Elon Musk has made very clear, we'll need a lot of it for those batteries. The new capital will be a part of this whole regional development plan. But at what cost? The move will displace indigenous people, who make up 20% of Indonesia's population. At least 20,000 people from 21 indigenous groups are at risk. Property prices are already surging in nearby Balikpapan, and indigenous residents are feeling shortchanged.
Nggak cocok. Harga tanah sana 20 juta satu perkan, bawa sini juga, nggak apa-apa. Ini kita 30.000 saja satu perkan. Nah kalau kami habis jual 1 hektar yang 30 juta atau 300 juta, bisa nggak kami beli lagi tanah? Nggak bisa. Mau tidak mau kami tidak punya tempat. Ini kan cara mengusir kami cara halus.
And it's not just humans. Borneo is also home to many endangered species, including the proboscis monkey, Bornean gibbon, and Sunda pangolin. The Bornean orangutan in particular has faced massive population decreases and will be severely affected by the new capital.
The bay will be like a transportation gate to the capital area, right? It's the water gate to the capital area. And at the same time, it is where all of those protected species are there.
East Kalimantan is rapidly losing its forests to industries like oil palm and logging. Also disappearing are mangrove and peatlands, which are important carbon sinks. Scientists are worried about the impact of the indirect carbon and ecological footprint, which could extend 200 kilometers from the center. Local economies dependent upon mangrove forests, like fishing, will also be at risk of total displacement.
Nanti kan jadi ramai juga buat masyarakat setempat, bisa menimbulkan banyak tenaga kerja, menampung masyarakat setempat bisa kerja di kota juga.
Nusantara's green plans look great on paper, but there's just one very large bummer.
Capital is actually sitting on the hinterland of coal.
4 of Indonesia's 5 biggest coal plants are in East Kalimantan. This means that much of the energy source for building the capital will come from there. This could spell disastrous pollution for the area and raises eyebrows about how the capital will fulfill its promise of zero emissions by 2045.
If you're talking about you're building a green city, you need to address the emission from construction materials as well.
Speaking of which, only 11.5% of Indonesia's national energy is currently renewable. The government has included solar and wind in its plans for Nusantara, but what's the concrete blueprint of its energy scheme?
No one knows. Everything is quite uncertain when it comes to Nusantara, but it will be quite natural to consider the resources they have, like this hydropower and the coal power plants to power the city.
And what about
Jakarta, what's going to happen to the city? You have your own capital, but don't forget about Jakarta, right? Because Jakarta is still sinking.
The government has made many attempts to fix Jakarta's chronic problems to no avail. It's tried cloud seeding, taxing groundwater usage, and developing alternative sources. But these solutions require massive capital and stringent implementation, which haven't happened. The only working strategy right now is a massive $40 billion project to upgrade the existing seawall in the shape of a mythical bird called a Garuda. And guess who's back in the picture for this?
The Dutch government, interestingly, the Dutch government built this huge giant Garuda.
It'll also have 17 artificial islands that are supposed to house hundreds of thousands of residents.
That plan was problematic because huge reclamation, it closed off the bay, and it's a kind of creating an exclusive city on top of Jakarta.
But it doesn't even address the main cause of Jakarta's flooding, which is land subsidence. Some analysts say the Giant Garuda is a nation-building project in which Dutch companies, Indonesian officials, and property developers stand to gain from lucrative contracts.
The Dutch kind of like reappearing, that's another dimension of reading the city from colonial to post-colonial.
The project, already mired in corruption, will take 30 to 40 years to complete. And even if all that gets done, Jakarta will remain an economic hub. Moving a few million people to Borneo will not solve its problems. Nusantara is just in the beginning phases of construction. It'll be at least 20 years or so before we see the city and its impacts. Will it succeed?
Depends on the definition of success. Is it just the government buildings like what we have seen in Myanmar? You just have several buildings in another place and then you call it a new capital. If this is the scenario, then the relocation basically don't bring much impact.
The scorecard for cities built from scratch is pretty patchy. Brasilia ended up notoriously segregated. Myanmar's Naypyidaw is mostly a ghost city. And Nigeria's Abuja urbanized fast, but didn't have affordable housing for residents, creating slums. And don't forget New Delhi. The British Raj made it India's new capital in 1911 after moving it from Calcutta. Today, the city faces the world's worst air pollution. New capitals are often post-colonial nation-building projects. They start out with lofty utopian goals, but often fall short of them, and always come at a steep cost to the environment and locals.
The government has to be very careful with that. And the first thing is they have to understand when the decision makers, they're not aware that there are some hidden impacts that they can't see.
It ends up that it's only for the political agenda, it's not going to work. A good city is a city for all. It's an inclusive and that is alive. There is a soul within that city.
Indonesia is not the only country planning a new capital right now. Egypt, South Korea, and Equatorial Guinea are just some of the countries planning or already constructing new headquarters. What about where you are? Tell us in the comments below and make sure to hit like and subscribe. We've got a new video coming at you every Friday. See you next time.